May 21, 1940. Open farmland south of Arras in northern France. Late in the afternoon of the 11th day of the German invasion of the West. The British Expeditionary Force is coming apart. German armored columns have torn through the French line at Sedan and run flat out for the Channel coast. And behind them the best divisions the Allies have are being folded into a pocket with the sea at their backs. Ahead, somewhere in the dust, the flank of a German Panzer Division is strung out on the march, thinking about the coast and not about its own shoulder. Rolling toward it at 8 miles an hour in 2 ragged columns, come 74 British tanks. The crews in the leading machines can see the German anti-tank gunners swinging their barrels around to meet them. They watch the muzzles flash. They hear the shells hit. And then they keep driving because the shells are bouncing off. In the next few hours, a hurried counterattack that almost nobody planned properly is going to frighten the German high command badly enough to matter. This is how it happened. To understand that field, you have to understand how bad the 11 days before it had been. The German attack that opened on the 10th of May had not come where the Allies expected. Instead of the wide sweep through Belgium they had war-gamed for years, the weight of it came through the Ardennes, the wooded hill country that French planners had written off as impassable to armor. 7 Panzer divisions came out of those woods, crossed the Meuse at Sedan, and turned west. There was almost nothing behind them. The French had spent their reserves moving north into Belgium, and the corridor the Germans cut ran clean through the middle of the Allied armies, separating the British and the French First Army in the north from everything else in France. By the 20th of May, the leading German tanks had reached the sea near Abbeville. The BEF, roughly 250,000 men, was now inside a bag that was closing. The British answer to that was a plan drawn up in a hurry with whatever was within reach. The idea was reasonable enough on paper. The German corridor was long and thin. The panzer divisions at the head of it had outrun their own infantry, and a hard blow into the side of that corridor near Arras might cut it. What the plan did not have was strength. The force scraped together for the job was 2 infantry battalions of the Durham Light Infantry, some supporting units, a handful of French tanks, and 2 battalions of the Royal Tank Regiment. Around 15,000 men in total against a German army group. It was given the name Frankforce after the officer commanding it, Major General Harold Franklin, and it was told to attack on the afternoon of the 21st with no time for reconnaissance and almost no coordination with the French on its flank. The tanks were the interesting part. British armor doctrine in 1940 split tanks into 2 families, and the split shaped everything that happened at Arras. Cruiser tanks were fast and thin-skinned and meant to exploit a breakthrough like cavalry. Infantry tanks were the other family. They were meant to walk at the pace of a rifleman, absorb everything the enemy could throw at them, and clear the way forward. Speed did not matter. Range did not matter. Only armor mattered. The second family produced a tank called the Matilda, and it was carried to the extreme. The Infantry Tank Mark II, the Matilda, was the best protected tank in the world in 1940, and it was not particularly close. The front of the hull carried up to 78 millimeters of steel. The cast turret was 75 millimeters all the way around. The sides ran between 65 and 70 millimeters, the rear 55, and even the suspension was covered by armored skirts. Put that next to what it was about to meet. The German Panzer III and Panzer IV of 1940 carried somewhere between 30 and 50 millimeters. The Soviet T-34, still a year away from its first battle and remembered ever since as the shock of the war, had 40 to 47 millimeters of sloped plate. The Matilda had close to double the armor of the tanks it was built to fight, and it had it in 1940. Everything else about the machine was a compromise made to pay for that steel. It weighed about 25 tons, and the engine bay could not be made big enough for one motor strong enough to move it, so the designers put in 2, a pair of 6-cylinder diesel bus engines geared together, producing something like 190 horsepower between them. That worked out to 7.5 horsepower per ton, which is close to nothing. On a good road, the Matilda made 15 miles an hour. Across a field it made about 6. The suspension was complicated and gave constant trouble, and the whole vehicle was slow and expensive to build, which is why there were never many of them. The gun is where the story turns. The Matilda carried a 2-pounder, a 40mm weapon, and against armor in 1940 it was genuinely good. Could kill any German tank on the field. What it could not do was fire a useful high-explosive shell. A high-explosive round for the 2-pounder was designed, and it was almost never issued because the shell was so small that the bursting charge inside it did not amount to much. The consequence of that decision would be paid for in the open ground south of Arras. A Matilda could destroy an enemy tank at 1,000 yards. Against a gun crew standing behind a shield in a field, it had a machine gun and very little else. Could beat armor. Could not suppress artillery. Then there is the other tank in this story, the one the legend has quietly written out. Of the 74 British tanks that attacked at Arras, only 16 were Matilda IIs. The other 58 were Matilda Is, and the Matilda I was a different animal entirely. It had been designed to a budget so tight that the specification was almost a joke. It carried a crew of 2, a commander who also aimed and fired, and a driver. Its armament was a single machine gun, either a .303 or a heavier .50 caliber Vickers, with no cannon of any kind. Its engine was a 70-horsepower Ford V 8 out of a truck, which pushed it along at 8 miles an hour flat out. What it did have was 60 millimeters of frontal armor, and that one number was the reason it was on that field. Only about 140 were ever built. A 2-man machine gun carrier, crawling at a walking pace, was about to be sent into a Panzer Division. The attack went in at around 3 in the afternoon on the 21st in 2 columns, and for the first hour it worked far better than it had any right to. The British came in behind the German spearheads and hit the soft parts of an army on the move, the supply trucks and the staff cars and the rear echelon columns that had assumed the war was somewhere out in front of them. The Matildas drove into that traffic and wrecked it. They ran into the flank of the SS Totenkopf Division and the motorized infantry of the 7th Panzer. And then the thing happened that made Arras famous. The standard German anti-tank gun of 1940 was the 37mm Pak 36, and against the Matildas it was useless. Crews stood their ground, laid their guns, and fired at ranges where they should not have been able to miss, and watched the shells strike the armor and skate off it. German accounts of that afternoon describe real panic. Anti-tank gunners abandoned their pieces. Infantry ran. The Totenkopf, an SS division whose men had been told a great deal about their own superiority, broke and gave up ground and several hundred prisoners. The man who stopped it was the commander of the 7th Panzer Division, Erwin Rommel, and he stopped it personally. With his division's anti-tank guns failing, he went to the one weapon on the field that could do the job. The 88mm Flak 36 was an anti-aircraft gun, a tall, awkward thing on a cruciform mount designed to throw a shell thousands of feet into the air at bombers. Depressed to fire flat across a field, it was something else. Rommel took the divisional artillery and every 88 he could reach, and he built a gun line by radio and in person, running between positions to sight the guns himself. When the Matildas came into that line at around 200 meters, the 88s opened fire, and the armor that had shrugged off everything else stopped matching. The shells went through and started fires inside. 24 British tanks were knocked out in a few minutes. The attack died in that field. The arithmetic afterward is where this story stops being a simple one. Frankforce lost 60 tanks out of the 88 committed that day. Only 28 came back. But of those 60 losses, just 2 were Matilda IIs. The gun line and the artillery had slaughtered the Matilda Is, the 2-man machine gun tanks with 60 millimeters of armor and no way to shoot back at a gun crew, and the 16 real Matildas had mostly survived and driven home. The legend of the tank that could not be killed at Arras is true. It belongs to 16 machines. The other 58 paid for the reputation. On the German side, the damage was worse than anything Rommel had taken so far. The 7th Panzer Division counted 89 men killed, 116 wounded, and 173 missing, and it lost around 400 men taken prisoner. Rommel had lost roughly 4 times as many men in one afternoon at Arras as he had lost in the entire breakthrough across France that preceded it. And when he reported it, he did not describe 74 tanks. He told von Rundstedt that his division had been attacked by hundreds of enemy tanks. Whether he was covering himself after being caught with his flank open, or genuinely could not tell in the confusion of an action like that, is something the sources leave open. Both explanations have been argued by serious historians, and the honest answer is that we do not know which it was. What is certain is what the report did. Ewald von Kleist, commanding the panzer group racing for the Channel ports, saw a serious threat to the corridor. Von Rundstedt ordered that the situation at Arras be put right before Kleist pushed on toward Boulogne and Calais, and the advance lost something like a day. On the 24th of May came the halt order that stopped the panzers short of Dunkirk, issued by Rundstedt and endorsed by Hitler. 2 days after that, the evacuation from the beaches began. It is very tempting to draw a straight line from a wheat field on the 21st to the boats on the 26th, and it should be resisted. The halt order is one of the most argued over decisions of the war, and historians have never settled it. German generals writing afterward, with their own reputations to manage, claimed Hitler stopped the tanks for political reasons, wanting to let the British army go in the hope of a negotiated peace. Others point to worn-out panzer divisions, boggy ground in front of Dunkirk, and Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe could finish the job alone. Arras belongs in that list. It is one input into a German command that had begun to flinch, and it bought time that the men on the beaches needed. It was not the reason by itself, and the British had no idea at the time that they had done anything at all except lose. The Matilda went on to have the career its performance at Arras deserved, in a different desert on the other side of the Mediterranean. In North Africa through 1940 and 1941, the Italian army had nothing that could touch it, and British crews began calling it the Queen of the Desert. The same 78mm that had defeated the Pak-36 in France defeated everything the Italians brought, and small numbers of Matildas took ground far out of proportion to their strength. Then the Germans arrived in Africa with the same answer Rommel had found at Arras, an 88 in the anti-tank role, and the rain ended quickly. The gun that killed the Matilda in a French field killed it again in Libya. Just under 3,000 were built before production ended in 1943, and by then a tank with a 2-pounder and 15 miles an hour had nothing left to offer a war that had moved on. The Matilda I did not get a second act. The 140 that were built were not worth shipping home. The survivors of Arras were abandoned in northern France in the days that followed, driven until they broke or left where they stood when the fuel ran out, and the type was quietly written off before the year was over. They are among the rarest tanks of the war now. The men in them had gone forward at 8 miles an hour, in a tank with a machine gun, into the flank of a panzer division, and most of them did not come back with their vehicles. The field south of Arras is farmland again. It has been plowed every year since.